Okay, we are now being recorded. Benson, would you like to start?
Certainly. So I assume that everyone here actually knows what an interim meeting is, but it occurred to me when I started putting this together that I sort of take it for granted that I do, and in fact, it turns out I was right. I did know what it means, but for those of you who have maybe never held an interim meeting, just to be explicitly clear, what we're talking about here are meetings that take place between the regular IETF meetings. And I don't need to labor this point. The principal purpose, of course, is to get more time than regular meetings. By the way, I should double check. Can people actually see the screen?
Yes.
Cool. I just assumed that I'm sharing it.
Oh, sorry. I should also mention I did upload the slides onto the wiki, so if anyone doesn't have visual, you can also go to the wiki and take a look at the slides there.
That's good. So the principal purpose, of course, of interim meetings is just to meet more often, to have more opportunities to meet. But the next couple slides, I think, like I said, I'm hoping, and I know Aaliyah is hoping, that we can get people thinking about some of the reasons that you might want to have interim meetings. Maybe think about how to think about whether you need in-person meetings or virtual meetings or whatnot. In general, there's a quote here which I think I borrowed from. And by the way, I assume that my screen keeps getting blocked out by these little messages, and I don't know how to turn them off. Well, whatever. In general, you're meeting more often. There's this quote here that I think I took from the reference that I listed there, but I think maybe that reference took from somewhere else. And I didn't put the source on here, I'm sorry, but that you're looking for high bandwidth discussions on specific issues. And it occurs to me, at least in my experience with interims, that sometimes they are basically just the same kind of rote process that you end up with in let's say, the regular meetings. We seem to sort of fall into a pattern where, we do a call for agenda items and people say, please, and please can I have 15 minutes for whatever. You fill up your time and then basically just flow through that script time after time, and that doesn't really seem to be the best use of it. It certainly doesn't seem to get us much further along than we can get in these 3 times a year regular meetings anyway. So kind of broadly speaking, we have options with the interim meetings. We can meet in person, of course, and of course, because it's face-to-face, it's sort of the highest bandwidth for us to communicate with one another. Of course, to do an in-person meeting, there's a number of logistics issues, which we'll touch on in a slide or two, and it requires area director approval in order to announce to the mailing list and make official. The face-to-face meetings, of course, in addition to having the highest bandwidth for communicating, they sort of remind us that we're all, as I put it here, as we're all human, right? We're all colleagues in this together, or however you want to say it, which, of course, sometimes has benefits well beyond the interim meeting itself. People knowing each other personally as colleagues, I think, actually allows for more productive and certainly friendlier list behavior later on. Virtual interim meetings, of course, they have a much lower cost because there's no physical space to coordinate or to be constrained by. There's no travel associated with getting there, and so on and so forth. It means you can have them more often. They are easier to announce because there's no travel requirements. There's a shorter time frame for the announcements beforehand, and basically any working group chair can simply decide to have them. You don't technically need any outside approvals other than probably you and your co-chair. Now that doesn't mean, of course, that you should sort of keep it to yourself. Go ahead and talk to your ADs, but because it can be exercised more often personally, and this is, this last bullet point here is probably worth discussion, unless it's just obvious to everybody that By having multiple lower cost meetings where you can exercise them more often, you can have voice discussion about an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours, whatever works, several times in between the regular meetings. But personally, I've used it a couple times as a release valve, if you will, a way to let people present drafts that they otherwise would want to take up time at a face-to-face meeting for. And of course, as we all know, sometimes those drafts aren't really justifiable at a face-to-face meeting. They would be somewhat of a waste of people's time. I put a footnote here to say that just because you're having lots of, let's say theoretically, lots of virtual interim meetings, and you have the ability to let people present, you still have to filter, right? You're not really supposed to just let everyone's time be wasted by random presenters that just want to take up time. So I'll actually pause there, and obviously I know everyone here can speak for themselves if they have something to say. I just want to invite comments on this, though, and ask if anyone has thoughts on the release valve idea behind interim meetings.
Well, it seems kind of like you've covered, both the pro and con side of that already. But since you invited comments anyway, I would really prefer that everyone, including me, err on the side of not wasting people's time. Actually, I feel like in a way, virtual interims, at least for me, need to be more focused because it's harder for me to focus on a teleconference than it is to focus, when there's an actual person in front of my face. So, hey, maybe we should, structure a BR interim for every working group where, it's only for pointless conversations, and then everybody can dial in and leave their computer talking to itself while they go have lunch. I'm only joking, but that sort of seems like the logical conclusion of this premise that it's a release valve.
So, hi, this is Sean Turner. From my experience in the TLS working group, we've actually got a high bandwidth list as well, and we're basically fairly ruthless about allowing people to come and speak at an in-person interim for exactly that reason, because you can go around circles and circles and circles so often on topics that you have to keep them focused and kind of kick them in the butt. And I find that one of the nice things about having an interim that's actually face-to-face is because it is actually a real meeting. It's been announced in the whole 9 yards. You can actually make movement and hard decisions at meetings, I'll be blunt, without the hangers-on that aren't actually contributing. Because there's lots of people that participate, but they're not really contributing, or they're slowing down or whatever. So by actually raising the bar of cost to come in terms of time and money, people that show up really, really care. And they're less apt to want to waste time because they flew to a different continent to talk about something for 2 days.
Yeah, so I think that's that's why this was maybe somewhat provocative, is that you don't want to waste people's time in any case, but you also want to make sure that you have the most valuable use of in-person face-to-face time, whether it's at the regular meetings or at the interims. And I think someone's raising their hand.
That's me. I've even learned how to raise hands in a virtual meeting. Let me know if I'm not clear. So I find that it's been very useful to try to push forward Yang models. Yang models in a larger meeting tend to sometimes put people to sleep, but it is a targeted meeting, and it does have an announced feature to it. So people, if you announce the agenda and what's happening, if they're interested, they'll dial in. If they're not, they won't dial in. And so targeted, focused topics seem to be better. Also, making sure that your key presenters are there, and sometimes corralling key commenters so you can actually have a substantive discussion. I also want to echo the fact that it's a really good place to have people relax and actually discuss on that, a particular topic for a more lengthy time period.
Yeah, so this is Sean again. One of the big things that I took away from, contentious mailings discussion is that people aren't so, frankly jerky in person because they're not going to say some of the things they might say on the list to other people into their face. And it definitely helps people kind of like calm down on the list later. So we've had a couple of times where we've had interims where it's been like, 200 email messages on one little topic, and people get together in a room and on a whiteboard and they solve it in 5 minutes, and it's like, oh, that's what you meant. So I don't know. I think those can be really valuable, and the dividends it pays later can actually really pay off if you can get everyone in the room. But that's the key, right, is trying to get all the key people in the room at the same time.
Sean? I wonder if you, you commented a couple of times on in-person interims, and if it's not stealing from Benson's presentation flow, I wonder if you want to say anything about in-person versus virtual. Do you have experience with virtuals that, leads you not to be praising them right now?
No, I mean, so the problem is, I'll be honest, right? In-person interims are a total pain in the butt. We'll get into all of this later. You're going to disappoint some constituency of people because not everyone is going to be able to make them. And so some people feel disenfranchised, so that's a problem. The times that I've been involved with virtual interims, they definitely have to be shorter, and you still have the challenge of, it is higher bandwidth, but it's harder to get people drawing on a whiteboard in person. So there's really a trade-off. I mean, I do like the idea of having them more frequently because you can knock off targeted topics and just kind of move on. And in-person interims, like, no one wants to fly to, some other continent for less than a day and a half or 2 days, because then it seems like a total waste of people's time. So the real trade-off is really in terms of cost. But if you have a working group that is really stuck on something and it's a big time, redesign the inners of the internet, it might be worth it to actually get on a plane and go.
Yeah, so in the next couple slides, and John, obviously you sort of noticed there was a flow here. The next couple slides talk in terms that you might ask yourself, why am I trying to have an interim meeting in the first place? And this discussion's been good. I think it's actually touched on some of these already, but obviously, whether it's an in-person interim or a virtual interim meeting, having more meetings allows you to have more time to work on things, which of course means more in-depth discussion if you're so inclined to structure the agenda that way, and more action if you can actually get people to produce things. And so for instance, if you have participants who are deadline driven, having more deadlines probably to some extent means more action and more success getting things done. Of course, that's not a rule, just a rule of thumb. But why, given that that's going to be generally true for all interims, why would you want to have a virtual interim versus a physical interim? The way that I look at it is because a virtual interim is relatively low cost. A virtual interim is easy to put together, and people can participate if they have the time available for the meeting, as opposed to the time and money and so on available for several days of travel. So I think if you know that there are, as some of these bullet points are saying here, if you know that there is simply a need for more bandwidth, a voice conversation where you can resolve issues or go through lots of detail or a long list of things, focused discussion where everyone is kind of getting on the same page, or once they're on the same page can move very quickly. If that's what you're looking for, then I think obviously face-to-face is always good, but a virtual interim may do the job. In-person interims have additional benefits that you have to judge as a chair if those benefits make up for the cost. Obviously, if you have people getting together in person, there's a different a different level of understanding that you can achieve looking at everyone's face. You can also, as the first point on this slide points out, you can also co-locate with, let's say, other working group interim meetings or other non-IETF meetings, whatever makes sense if you think there are other communities that you want to have involved. So as a working group chair, I think it's important to ask yourself these, and I think in the discussion that we were just having, several people touched on this question. Why would I have virtual interim meeting versus an in-person interim meeting, what's the cost-benefit trade-off? And I think as chairs, we ought to be thinking about these things as we try to make progress. And something just happened here. Did we lose Aaliyah?
Yeah, we lost Aaliyah, but she said she's coming back, and it looks like the meeting is surviving okay.
Yeah, I just got a pop-up that said I'm now the host of the meeting, so.
Well, good for you. I'll have a beer, please.
Yeah, all right. I'll have one sent over. All right, well, I'll keep running this, and we'll see what happens when she comes back. So, so as I said, you know, as a working group chair, it's important to ask yourself what you're trying to achieve, what your working group needs, and decide if there's a cost, you know, a cost that's worth spending for the benefit of face-to-face. I think certainly, you know, just a kind of a personal view of this, I think having in-person interim meetings earlier in the life of a working group, where you have participants that need to meet one another, get to know each other as people, I think there's a great deal of value to that. And then, of course, you know, periodically, if you have difficult conversations or things that you need that you really think would benefit from a whiteboard or whatever, then I think it's worth looking at the cost. Of course, like I said, and like others have said as well, because the virtual interim meetings are low cost, you can do them more regularly, and to some extent having people get together on a regular basis. You know, let's say I've seen different working groups take different approaches every 1 or 2 weeks or every month. If you have some kind of regular cadence, then to some extent that allows people to still know each other in a human way that helps facilitate things on a mailing list. So you might think of this as a cycle as well, not just a one-time kind of problem. And I think maybe Aaliyah came back here.
This is Sue, Benson.
Hey, Sue.
One thing that I learned from other chairs in holding interims, by the way, IHRS is on a bi-weekly cycle. Keep it on the same day, same time. Don't mess with the day. So even if you're going to do it monthly, which I guess is where IDR is at this time, do it on the same day, because then you don't then you can schedule it with other interims. People are now beginning to happen. So get your day in and your time in. And if you're doing 3 continents, that may mean you see a lot of 10 a.m. East Coast calls or 11 a.m. East Coast calls, because it's best for China and Europe and U.S. Anyway, that's my feedback.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think having something that's predictable for the participants is wildly helpful, because at least for me personally, I know if something's going to happen regularly, I can just block it out in my calendar in advance. And on the other hand, if things could pop up with a couple weeks notice at any time, you know, I'm making up this number, but it could be a 50-50 shot whether I could actually attend. So I agree with that. The time zone thing is even more complicated. I've tried to look at it for past meetings where every participant that came to mind was geographically and more importantly time zone wise located, and sort of lay out where if I was going to have a couple of meetings, what time should I place them in order to make sure that everybody can at least attend one of them. And it turns out that's just nearly impossible. I mean, it's a big planet, and someone's always sleeping. So yeah, that's a challenge. I found 10 a.m. Eastern seems to work best for the kind of core group of participants in NBO3 meetings, but everybody's mileage will vary. And it's just a hard problem. I think I mentioned that on a slide in 1 or 2 slides. I think Adrian's making jokes in chat, but I can't read them. So the one thing that I want to put this slide together. What I was thinking is that. One thing to keep in mind also, much like earlier, I made a comment that I guess sometimes we in the IETF as chairs, we fall into this routine of simply putting together an agenda based on requests and then just running through it, and it's almost like it's a pattern or a script that kind of gets old. Likewise, I make some assumptions about what I think an interim meeting or a virtual interim meeting looks like. For instance, here we are on a webex, and as somebody who sits on a lot of these, whether it's a webex or whatever tool, these web and audio screen sharing type of meetings, I assume that that's the best thing. Of course, as a working group chair, you should not take that for granted. You should think about what's actually best. I almost on a version of this slide when I first started drafting it, I almost included things like interpretive dance or whatever, just to be silly, but to make the point that some communities of people, for instance, in certain open source projects, I know they have regular IRC meetings, and personally, I sort of find them irritating. But that's just me personally. It may be for your community of working group contributors that something works better as a central piece of whether it's, let's say, IM sessions for visually looking at text together, or presenting slides like we are now, or whatever. They're all up for grab, and I think we know that, but we as working group chairs probably, like I said, fall into a routine and don't frequently question what the best tools might be. And so then talking about scheduling, because this was, we were just talking about this too, it helps to avoid, obviously, deciding how often, how long you're going to have meetings. I think having a regular cadence is definitely helpful. Having meetings that don't overlap with other meetings, of course, is also helpful. And as we know, excuse me, as we know from the conflict resolution issues we have around the regular IETF meetings, this can be hard. Fortunately, with interim meetings at the moment, it's not completely insane. There are many more days that people are able to scatter their meetings across, and there are fewer interim meetings right now. The list of interim meetings, I've put a URL here. It shows you basically all the future interim dates. So if you sort of get it together and schedule them out ahead of time, we can fill in this list, and people can see where they want to avoid meetings in the future, where you would want them to take place. And of course, as we've said again, that you're going to disappoint some constituents. There's in a truly global working group, there's always going to be somebody sleeping somewhere, and which means either them losing sleep or them missing the meeting or whatever. You have a key set of people that obviously need to be there, the chairs and if you have a secretary, people that take notes, and of course presenters and discussion leaders, people that are actually kind of key to the topics that you want to discuss. I think to some extent, because of the global disappointment that time zones introduce, I think you have to prioritize some attendees, and it's an unfortunate reality. Of course, in doing that, the IETF rules in general say this, and of course, it's good advice anyway to be fair and open and make sure that you don't put meetings that are sort of intentionally inconvenient for some people. That should be obvious, but it's worth just repeating. Just some of the mechanics, there's a couple slides here on the mechanics of it. Announcement timeframes, 4 weeks for in-person meetings, only 2 weeks for interim, virtual interim meetings. And the process is simple. You basically craft a message that you're going to send to your mailing list and ask the secretariat to relay it. For in-person meetings, they'll require the area director to approve it. And for virtual interim meetings, they'll just pass it along. And I warn you, they will literally just pass along what you send them. So so don't include a bunch of draft text that you mean to revise before you submit it to them.
Benson, can I interrupt a second?
Of course.
One piece that is also important is making sure that you send out the agenda a week ahead of time, particularly for the virtual interims, and certainly for the in-person interims. It's very useful to have the agenda sent out more than a week ahead of time so people can make flight arrangements. But the main point I'd say with all of these time frames is their process that exists to make sure that you get the right people on the call, that you get the people who are actually active and care, that they have a chance to rearrange their schedules, to change any other meetings that are conflicts, and that type of thing. This isn't process for its own sake, which I loathe, but rather making sure people are going to be there. And yes, obviously I agree with Jeff that making sure slides are sent out a day or two ahead of time is also really helpful. But a lot of the time in virtual interims, a large piece of it is the conversation. And I really feel the key piece is get the agendas out, make sure that people know why they're going to care to come to the meeting.
I agree, yeah. And it's especially tempting, and I'll tell you that I know I've been guilty of this for virtual interim meetings, to kind of wing it and say, well, people can show up with their slides at the last minute, and because they're relatively low cost and we're going to have multiple of them between, let's say, now and the next in-person meeting, it sort of lets you play it a little more loose, and to some extent there's value there, but of course, as you're pointing out, it's also not really helpful or fair to everybody that might want to attend. So yeah, I mean, like I said, I'm guilty of that certainly, but it's probably important for everyone to keep in mind that the process is there for a reason. So I'll also point out, some of the tools that we're using. For instance, setting up a WebEx session. It allows you to automatically send a message to the mailing list, which has a calendar, an iCal entry that you can download. I find that's helpful as well for even if you're not ready to publish the agenda or send out official notices, it sometimes helps just to let people give people places to mark in their calendar, and then make sure that people are aware of the meeting in advance as you put together let's say a call for agenda and an agenda that you publish, gathering slides, that sort of thing.
Can I make a comment?
Please.
Yeah, I want to speak in favor of actually being, I guess, more of a jerk rather than more casual about, holding people to an agenda and getting their stuff in on time and so on, at least for virtual meetings, because, again, I find it more challenging to stay focused as a participant in a virtual meeting. So I really appreciate having one topic, as Sue said, and then also, or one overarching topic, and then having the materials really well in place before then. And I think it helps keep the speakers focused also if they have to, think through their speaking materials beforehand, rather than sort of staying fast and loose. Yeah, it's very attractive as a chair to say, yeah, we're going to be casual, because it's obviously work for the chairs to put together a tight agenda beforehand. Yeah, so I guess that's about it.
So this is one of the, we scheduled an IDR interim on the 12th, and I canceled it because I didn't have slides. I would like to have slides a week ahead. I'm having trouble getting, even with lots of warm emails, I'm having trouble getting slides because people are used to the IETF meeting where the slides pop up sometimes 2 days beforehand, before the actual meeting date. So it's taking me a little bit more work to get people to say, please send me the slides, a week ahead of time is what I want, and if I don't have it at 5 days, I got to cancel. That's becoming a challenge to their thinking process.
Well, I guess one last comment is, while it's true that the bar is lower to creating a virtual interim, if we don't treat them, at least as seriously as we do in-person ones, the bar is also lower to blowing off a virtual interim. So if we start communicating through, words or actions that we think these aren't as important as, quote, real, unquote, meetings, our attendees will start treating them like they're not real meetings.
I think those are all good points, and I guess there's one thing I want to say might contribute to this view that they're somewhat less formal, and yet is in itself valuable, and that is that we can structure the agenda to be more discussion-oriented and less about presentations. In which case, there may not be that much material to prepare, and a discussion is, I think, kind of inherently more informal, more loose, more open, whatever way you can describe that. And I think it's good to have these discussions, and having interim meetings, virtual interims especially, means that you can sort of put more time into, let's say, just having a 1 hour meeting that's focused on one thing, for example, and having half an hour or 45 minutes of that meeting centered around discussion as opposed to presentations and so on. And so like I said before, I'm not trying to defend the practice of getting really loose with the process. I actually think you guys are right that adhering to it more strictly is useful. But at the same time, whereas we might say there's only 2 minutes left before the next presentation slot at an in-person meeting, and therefore we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Here in a virtual interim especially, I think allowing more people to talk for more time is something that we should build in to the process. That's my personal view.
Now, I guess I have a quick question. Maybe I have 2 quick questions. One is that apparently raising hand on the WebEx doesn't actually do anything. But the other thing is,
good points.
In-person virtual interim meetings, I'm assuming, have to be for like a whole day or a couple of days because people are flying long distances. Virtual interims, are we assuming they're generally short, like an hour or 2, or is there also distinction between ones that are like an hour and 2 versus ones that are a whole day or a good chunk of a day?
I think obviously, well, it's obvious to me that as a chair, you can do whatever you need to do with regard to that. I think what I've personally found useful is to have something like a 1.5 or 2 hour virtual interim meeting, and then to do that repeatedly, let's say several times between in-person meetings. And that's easier to get people's attendance and so on. Of course, that also means you have less time for really long kind of discussion, open discussion. And so a 4 hour or even an all-day virtual interim meeting it's certainly not unheard of. And I guess if I read between the lines of what you're saying that sometimes those might be helpful.
Well, I don't know. I honestly don't know about a full-day virtual interim. One issue with a virtual interim is that people don't fly there, so they're on whatever time zone they happen to be living in. And I think it's hard enough to get an hour that's good for everybody. I mean, I guess you make it so Hawaii is the middle of the night since the Pacific's so large that it makes a gap in where people are. But I would think an hour or 2 would be easier to schedule from that regard, but I hadn't thought about whether a full day in virtual interim is useful or not.
So I think Sean, sorry, we've done we've actually, when we've done in-person interims, we actually usually have a WebEx running and people dialing in on Skype too, and sometimes they stay all day. Sometimes they don't. It's kind of up to them depending on the topic and the timing. So I would think a long-term virtual interim would be difficult. I've done it in the past, like attend IETF meetings, like the whole week virtually. It's pretty hard, but people do it.
Yeah, I've been in meetings for in a WebEx for a long period of time, and I think it's difficult to keep focus when everybody's in the WebEx. I think 3-4 hours is a good limit if the variety of people are WebExed in. Now, as opposed to people that are in a room and taking breaks and having lunch and whatever.
Yeah.
But the other part is, if you're doing a physical interim, you should make sure that there is remote access, because not everybody will be able to fly in, and there may be some dedicated people. But with virtual interims, I agree, it's really hard to stay focused past 2 or 3 hours.
Yeah, but then you have a critical mass that's maintaining the momentum with the WebEx. Whereas if everybody's virtual, it's sort of yeah, I've been in meetings, 4-hour meetings, and that gets to be a long time on WebEx.
Yeah, I know personally. Again, I'll admit to I don't know, to my advice in this particular case, that on really long virtual meetings, especially one where there's a lot of topics going on, you know, if I start to drift off, or I'll look at my phone because it flashes something at me, you know, that it's easier for people to get away with that if there aren't others physically watching, and that I think means that for especially virtual interim meetings that take a long time, you know, like 4, 6, 8, whatever hours, you're very likely to have participants drifting in and out. So I don't know. I could see the benefits of having, you know, longer periods of time at a single sitting, but it might make sense to if you need that sort of time together, it might make sense to push a little further for a physical meeting. I don't know. Again, just to reiterate what I said earlier, it's up to you as the chairs to figure that out and to make a plan. For the sake of time, I'm going to hop into a couple slides further here, especially because somebody a moment ago actually touched on this, that when you're having an in-person meeting, obviously there are these logistics to think about. You need physical space that's you know, big enough for the number of people you're going to have, and you need to make sure that those people can get into the building. You know, if there's a security process for let's say your corporate office or whatever. But because we were talking about, you know, taking breaks and so and eating and so on, you have to consider also that people will need breaks, bio breaks, you know, food, that sort of thing, and this is where I actually thought I had a bullet point on this slide. It might pop up somewhere else, but where in mixed meetings where you have some virtual participants and some in-person participants. I've noticed and experienced firsthand on both ends of that how complicated it can be to get the audio working when you've got people face-to-face in a room, and you know, they're literally just chatting with each other, and that's the high bandwidth part, and one of the biggest benefits of an in-person interim meeting. Unfortunately, the remote participants, you know, they need audio, they need people to use mics. In some rooms, it may actually be fundamentally difficult to get, for instance, a phone line patched in, or you know, audio from somebody's laptop, you know, wired into the room speakers or whatever. That's one of the things that we get to take for granted at a regular IETF meeting, because someone else takes care of it for us. And if anyone has magical tools that make this all better, I'd love to hear about it. But for my part, at least, I found it to be tricky.
So I have to actually expand on that one point in particular. When you're dealing with remote meetings, the microphone stuff is nowhere near as good. People are not good about microphone protocol at IETFs to start with, and it becomes even more important when significantly more people are virtual. Whereas, you know, the physical meetings, we tend to have 95, 98% of the people are actually there, and maybe 1 or 2% of people there are just willing to go through Jabber.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you're right. I think that was Jeff speaking. The interim meetings have I think a much higher likelihood of remote participants having issues. Of course, if everybody is on equal footing and everybody's on the WebEx and phone bridge and whatever together, then you know, everyone experiences the same, they have the same experience, or at least something roughly similar. And so, at least in my experience, it's, you know, in a virtual interim, you have different problems, which are, for instance, that people don't know what they're doing. They leave their phones unmuted, or they don't understand, you know, how to unmute themselves, or to, you know, raise their hand or whatever. That's somewhat easier for people to kind of, it's just a learning curve thing. The physical space, you know, trying to blend the physical meeting together with the virtual, I've never actually had much luck doing that. At least not outside of a actual IETF, you know, secretariat managed meeting. So with just a couple minor points to put on here, from my experience setting up in-person interim meetings, you know, things that you again take for granted that the secretariat will do for a regular meeting. Things like actually telling people where the meeting is, you know, what airport do they need to fly into, what are the local hotels that they can use. Certainly some of us have, let's say, company offices where we might host a meeting that are somewhat more, let's say, suburban or difficult to get to, and so all of these things. Again, this is just kind of the logistic pain of having an in-person meeting, but it's important to keep in mind and remember to do these things, even if you take it for granted that people know, for instance, where to fly to for a meeting in suburban Boston, right? So in any case, the last bullet is also something helpful to think about, and I don't know if there are other tools or if the IETF even has a tool, but in particular when you try to coordinate to figure out how many people are going to show up and therefore how big of a room you need, and of course you want a list of names to give to your security at the front desk so that they can coordinate some kind of entry process for attendees. It helps to have a sign-up tool. Eventbrite is the one that I'm familiar with. You can go create an event. People can submit, basically get a ticket for it, and give you a name, then you have a count, that sort of thing. So for in-person meetings, especially, having sign-up tools like that, I think, are very helpful.
Just a quick comment here. I agree with you, but when we did the I2RS physical interim a couple years, almost 2 years ago now, we had a serious problem where more than twice as many people RSVP'd that they would be coming in person, actually well more, and as many again that they would be remote. And so we spent a lot of time trying to figure out getting the right size room and setting up the meeting so that it would work, since we were looking for interactive collaboration, trying to figure out how to make it work, and not to mention, of course, ordering refreshments that would handle that quantity of people. So even though it's a bit more of a pain, I would actually really advocate charging something for it. Not a lot, and it can just pay for refreshments or whatever, but you've got to be aware that if there's not a cost, there will be people who will just say, oh yeah, sure, I'll come, and actually won't change those RSVPs. And other than charging, I'm not trying to fix that problem.
That's a good point. And I'll tell you, I've actually had the opposite happen, which is where people don't sign up and show up anyway. Not particularly for IETF meetings, but for other meetings I've helped run. And I actually think your suggestion of having a cost helps with that as well, because then people take it more seriously that they have to sign up. There's some kind of barrier they feel obliged to pass through.
Yeah, and the worst case is you end up with really great refreshments.
Yeah, too much coffee is not usually a problem for me. So, moving on here, and I think I don't want to labor over the mechanics too much, but of course, the mechanics of running a meeting, in particular a virtual meeting, there's some things that as the chair you should try to be familiar with the tools you're using, because you can probably assume that some number of your participants won't be, and in particular, let's say on a WebEx, being able to turn off the entry and exit beeps, making sure that, for instance, people enter on mute, and so on. Just deciding how you're going to manage that up front, and then sort of actively paying attention to it during the meeting is important. Obviously, as the presenter, sometimes, like for instance, what I'm doing right now, I've got my presentation on full screen mode, and I actually can't see a number of things that are going on. So it helps to think about how, when you're running the meeting versus when you're presenting, maybe coordinating with, with your co-chair to figure out how, who's going to take on what responsibilities and so on. Once you've decided how you're going to run things, I usually just open up a meeting, a virtual interim meeting, communicating what's going to happen, which is basically everyone in my meetings. Usually, everyone gets to mute and unmute themselves, but you're going to start off in a muted mode and go from there. But I always reserve the right to kind of force people to raise hands and that sort of thing if discussion gets out of hand. Fortunately, it has not happened to me yet, but of course, you have to be prepared with some backup plans. In particular, the raised hand thing, for instance, is difficult for me right now because I can't actually see the full list of attendees unless I drag a window over the top of my slides, which of course is why it helps to have someone else paying attention for questions and answers. Yeah, just we've already touched on this, but the last bullet point is what I was trying to say earlier, that it's hard to blend remote participation and in-person meetings. Personally, my take is to avoid that we as chairs should avoid ruining the value of an in-person meeting in order to facilitate, remote participants. That being said, it doesn't mean throw out the attempt and don't even bother. You should definitely try to do what you can. But when it comes down to it, I think when you've got however many people flying, however far they've flown, and spending whatever they're spending in order to be face-to-face, the last thing you want to do is sort of insult all of that effort and cost by making them sort of, push their own bandwidth down to whatever level you can get for remote participants.
Yeah, and this is Sean again. Because you're doing it on a shoestring with probably some bad microphones in the whole 9 yards, it usually ends up being a complete nightmare anyways. So though we've had WebEx running the whole time, we usually put them on mute, and
yeah,
right, and you end up ruining the in-person meeting completely.
Yeah, and that's exactly how I feel. I don't want to discourage people from even trying. I think it's helpful to especially figure out some way to get audio streaming for people, that people can see the slides through a WebEx, whatever. So some of that is easy and does not really take away from the in-person meeting, the value that people get by being there in person. So do what you can. On the other hand, I've been in rooms where there just literally is no audio set up, and it's designed for a small number of people, and you take what you can get sometimes. And then of course, we've touched on this a little bit earlier, but my take for IETF working group meetings in general is that it's, in particular for the regular meetings where we have kind of a process we follow and people present stuff, it's easy to have a number of topics come up. When you have interim meetings, especially when you have virtual interim meetings where you can actually say we're going to have a number of these virtual interim meetings, it's somewhat easier to focus the agenda around particular topics. So for example, I've been experimenting with having just a couple of topics in NBO3 that we need to talk about, and trying to have virtual interim meetings that rotate or alternate back and forth between those topics, so that any one meeting is focused on one topic. And I see some chat messages popping up, but faster than I can read them. If anyone wants to say something, just speak up. So yeah, keep in mind you want to focus the agenda. Personally, I think that means rejecting presentations that are off topic, and maybe going after and pursuing, literally asking people to present on particular topics that you want, and then having an open discussion section in the agenda where you sort of lay the ground rules. You say we've got 30 minutes to talk about this topic, and that's what we're going to talk about. Off-topic things, will get shut down, but otherwise, speak up. And I found that to be very valuable, especially for making progress in areas that have been a little slow on a mailing list. And just to kind of wrap up what, in terms of process, we have to treat these like regular meetings. In particular, we have to take minutes. We have to take blue sheets and, submit all of this to the Secretariat. The blue sheets thing actually has been fairly confusing. First of all, I put blue sheets in quotes here because there is a blue sheet template that you can print out, and then, of course, unless you have blue paper, it won't be blue. So, whatever, you get the point. There's a link to a PDF there that you can print out for in-person meetings. For virtual meetings, of course, you have to figure out how to take down a list of those attendees yourself. And sometimes it's helpful if you have, for instance, a WebEx going on. You can literally just go take a snapshot of the names that are in the attendees list, and then transcribe those later. Of course, people come and go, and it's possible that you're going to end up missing somebody who maybe showed up late and left early, and you just didn't happen to snapshot them. So there's a little bit of a challenge there, and it's probably worth talking about other ways to capture these. Certainly, requiring a registration, let's say in something like Eventbrite or whatever tool, might help figure out who's anticipated at the meeting. But whether that means they actually attend or not is another question. So, but once you have proceedings, you have slides, minutes, and so on, and you upload them to the material manager. They will be posted on. There's a URL there at the footnote number 2, which lists all of the working group interims and links to their materials. So once you create the meeting in the material manager, it'll show up there, and you can actually send that URL out to your meeting participants. And that's the end of my main slides. Because I just talked about creating a meeting in the material manager, I actually wanted to show you guys, because I was not aware of this, and I was always sending emails to the Secretariat asking them to do this for me. And I don't know when it appeared in the tools, but you can now do this yourself. If you go into the chair dashboard, you can create an interim meeting, which allows you just to type in the date and submit it. It creates a meeting which looks just like, from your point of view as a chair, managing the meeting materials, looks just like a normal in-person meeting. And that's it. Anything you guys want me to go back and touch on?
Thanks a lot, Benson. I think what I'm going to do now is stop the recording so we can have a little bit of free conversation, if that works for everybody. Okay.
Good for me.
Stopping now.